That's fantastic. Thanks, and thanks to Louisa for sorting that out. So I don't have very long, so I'll get started. I want to make sure to leave some space for questions. So in terms of what I'll cover, I'm going to talk about the findings from our recent survey, which many of you will have participated in. We had responses from 83 large employers right across the economy, together employing nearly 1 million staff. So it's a very representative snapshot of UK employment at the moment, and you can see the breakdown there. I'll also talk quite crucially about the outlook for certain key indicators that will affect your decisions on pay in the coming year. So I'll talk about inflation, and I'll talk quite a bit about the labour market and where I think it's at and where I think it might be going. And then I'll try and use that as a jumping off point for some ideas really about what the pressures on pay are at the moment, on the downward pressures on the one hand, but also probably more crucially at the moment, the upward pressures. Finally, I'll identify some of what I think are the key issues, but I'd be very happy to hear what you think as well, and we'll create some space for that at the end. So if we can just go into the first slide, that's brilliant. Oh, it seems to have gone. Let's move that along. How's that? Can everybody see that?
No.
No.
Oh, yes.
Ah, right. So if we go into the first slide, there we go. So we asked employers about the factors behind their decisions on pay this year. And there's three things to take away from quite a complex slide. On the one hand, as we heard from Louisa, market benchmarking, so looking at what other employers are paying, has shot up the rankings. So that's number one. Number two, the impact of coronavirus on pay decisions is much less in evidence than it was last year. And then there's a smaller change, which is the importance of the national living wage. So it was good that we had Tim talking about that earlier, because that's clearly more important to you. Let's move to the next slide, please. So that's what employers were doing this year. In terms of next year, next slide, please.
We're having lots of issues here, Ken. I don't know what's going on. Sorry.
No problem. That's okay. Great. Yeah, that's
what you want. Sorry.
Yeah, that's the one. I think it is anyway. So that's this year, and as Zoe said earlier, we're pretty much done with the pay round for 2021. So looking ahead to next year, the survey responses are really useful for kind of tracking what next year might look at. And one of the key questions we ask employers how next year's pay award, I've just lost the slide now. There we go. How next year's pay award might compare with the one that they've just made. So if you look to the pie chart on the right, that shows us the responses last year to this question. In other words, we were asking them at the time what their 2021 pay award would look like in comparison to their 2020 pay award, if that makes sense. And what we saw last year in the depths of the pandemic was that nearly half of respondents expected that the award next year would be lower. That was the outturn last year. But if you look to the left of the slide, you can see that the situation has completely changed. Rather than half saying that pay awards next year will be lower, in fact, half are saying that next year's pay awards will be higher. So a clear indication of the likely direction of travel next year. So you might ask what's driving all this, and the next few slides will hopefully indicate that. So Louisa, if you're able to pick up the next slide, and that's great, thank you. So we've also asked employers what the influences are on their forward plans for 2022. So given that they've said that they think pay awards will be higher, why is that? There's three takeaways again from a quite complex slide. The first is that as we saw with 2021, and the same again for next year, market comparisons and benchmarking is really important for employers, and that's shot up the rankings in this for next year's pay decisions as well. The other point is that recruitment and retention, last year it only ranked a bit further down when it came to pay decisions. It was at 49% of respondents. This year, some 70% of respondents said it was important or very important. So recruitment and retention is really shaping the forward picture. And the other point as well is the going rate for increases is also in pay setters' minds as well. And I guess that's good for our business in terms of our ongoing monitoring of what's happening on pay reviews. The research that Zoe presented earlier on. So that's one of the things that's driving the current picture. So what are employers going to actually do? So the next slide shows this. And we asked employers what their actions in the reward sphere would be next year. And again, it's not surprising to hear that it's really all about pay. Benchmarking right up at the top there. So a real focus on the external market, but at the same time there's an internal pay focus as well. Given that employers, some 42% told us that they would look to change pay structures. That's interesting. Bonus schemes are in focus as well, and there's a little bit about benefits. Maybe not as important as the pay elements, but it's certainly part of the picture as well. So there's a kind of dual focus. On the one hand, the external market is very important for employers, but on the other hand, they're looking to internal equities and internal relativities as well, as evidenced by the responses around pay structures and bonus schemes. So if we can just move to the next slide, please, Louisa. We asked a little bit about inflation, and I'll just run through this quickly. We always ask this question just to find out what inflation indicators employers are actually using, because those of you who make these decisions will know there's more than one, confusingly enough. And some people prefer one more than the other. So our responses this year, as in previous years, indicate that the largest proportion reference the CPI. And the CPI is the measure that appears most in media reporting of inflation. It's not the Office for National Statistics lead indicator, that's the CPIH. But nevertheless, I think because it gets the most prominence in the media and tends to be foregrounded by the government, albeit it's not a very good measure of inflation because of the different elements that it excludes. It does tend to get a lot of prominence. It also tends to be lower than the RPI, so that's perhaps a factor in its preference by employers as well. So the CPI is up at the top. The RPI, though, isn't too far behind. That came in at 72%. And then the CPIH, which I've just mentioned as the ONS's preferred indicator, that shot up this year in employers referencing it from 28% last year to 59% this year. So it's moving up the rankings. Employers are taking notice of it. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the CPIH represents an attempt to correct some of the shortcomings of the CPI by including an estimate of housing costs. And I think that's the reason for that. So that's quite interesting. But I think what the findings show is that the RPI is still widely trusted as an indicator, despite it no longer having official national statistics status. Now, even though that's the case, by the way, I should let you know that there's an intense debate about this in statistician circles, with many statisticians disagreeing quite clearly with the government over their kind of downgrading of the status of the RPI. So that's important to know. I won't go on about it too much now, but if anybody's got any questions about that, I'll be happy to deal with it. So that's just what inflation indicators employers use. How about the relationship of next year's pay awards to inflation? Because we do ask that in the survey as well. And this slide shows the results, and I think, as you'll see, it's quite interesting. The results show that nearly a third, just under 3 in 10, said that the pay award next year will be at the level of the CPI or the CPIH, and we say CPI or CPIH because they tend to be quite close in terms of the percentage rate at which inflation is rising, as shown by those indicators. A further 27% say that the rise will be above the CPI but below the RPI. So between, what those two indicators might show. And then 30% say that the rise next year will be either at or above the RPI. And by the way, there was more saying that it will be at the RPI than will be above it. I think it was 2010 or thereabouts. So what we've got is an indication that when it comes to pay rises next year, 84%, well over 4/5 will be at or above inflation, however you measure that. And only less than 1 in 5, 16% will be below it. So that's very interesting. It's very interesting, by the way, in the light of yesterday's very sharp rise in inflation, which I'm sure most of you will have seen. And that takes me quite neatly to something else I wanted to talk about, which is that separately from the surveys we conduct that you very kindly participate in, we also talk to economists in a variety of city institutions about their predictions for inflation and what they think it's going to look like over the coming year. And this chart shows the likely outturn. We collected these forecasts, by the way, in August. So they show what the economists thought the inflation picture would look like from August, just gone, to February 2023. So those two lines show the likely path of the CPI in blue and the RPI in orange above it. And now, by the way, a couple of things I wanted to point out about it. If you look at the far left of the chart, those are the figures for August. So that's what the economists were saying, or at least it's our average of the economists' predictions for the figure that's just been released. And in fact, both the CPI and the RPI were higher than the average predictions from the economist. So in other words, they've underestimated the rate at which inflation is rising. So it could be that you should take these forecasts and add a couple of percentage points to each of them. But nevertheless, they're the ones we've got at the moment. We'll collect some new ones a little bit further down the line and we'll see where we are then. But what it shows is that inflation is likely to peak in November at just above 5% on the RPI. Could be higher, like I've just said, and just below 4% on the CPI. Now, that's the figure that will be released in November. It's the figure for November that will be released in December. In other words, it's the inflation figure that will be extant on the 1st of January when many organizations review pay for the coming year. So that's going to be difficult, obviously. With inflation so high, employees will be expecting a rise that means that their pay keeps track with rises in the cost of living. Thereafter, though, the economists think it might dip a bit, but there'll be a further peak, a smaller peak, if you like, and that will be for the March figures. The February figures, which will be released in March, and again, those will be extant on the 1st of April. Again, the point at which many employers will be reviewing pay. So, the picture on inflation is looking like it's going to rise over the coming period. I mean, there's a number of factors creating this situation. One is the shortages of various goods that we've seen. That's feeding into it. Two other factors include the rise in utility prices that we're likely to see in the autumn. That's going to feed into the autumn rise in inflation. And the other factor as well is that you'll remember that the government cut VAT on hospitality services in the depths of the pandemic. That's going to be restored in 2 phases, and that's also a factor behind the rise in inflation. So, in the short term, at least, and at the points at which pay reviews will take place in the coming year, inflation is going to be relatively high, at least compared to what we've been used to. However, most economists, this does seem to be a consensus, tend to think that inflation will come down. In other words, that it's going to be a short-term phenomenon, largely driven by the shortages we're seeing as a result of the kind of simultaneous reopening of economies across the world in the wake of the pandemic. So that's inflation forecast. So if we actually, if you could just move back to the previous slide, Louisa, there was one more thing I wanted to say. Yeah, which was that if we take those forecasts and then kind of plug them into what we know about what employers are telling us about the coming year, we could see annual pay reviews registering at between around 3.5% and 5.5% in January, February, March, and April next year. That's if employers do indeed act as they've told us in the survey. So that's quite a big change compared to what we've seen this year. As Zoe indicated, pay settlements are running at around 2.5% still. Most of those were made in the early part of the year. We're now kind of past the main period for pay reviews. So the kinds of the inflationary pressures that I've presented here have kind of yet to play. But if they do, and if employers act in the way that they've been telling us they'll act, then we could see much higher pay rises come next year. That's the prognosis. Let's see what happens. So as to how likely this is, I want to talk a little bit now. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Louisa. Thanks very much. So inflation's one input into your decisions, but obviously the labour market is a very important one as well. So how do we characterise the labour market at the moment? Well, overall, I'd say it's tightening up in certain respects. Now, that's not to say that there aren't areas of softness, and I'll come to those in a minute. But on all the key indicators, it does seem to be tightening up. Employment is up, as indicated there. Payroll employment is back to pre-pandemic levels, except, by the way, in London, the southeast, and Scotland. So that's interesting. There's a kind of regional effect there. Vacancies are at record levels, and unemployment is down. It fell below the magic figure of 5% last month, and it's down even further in the latest figures. Redundancies too, back to pre-pandemic levels. Economic inactivity, which, by the way, increased significantly during the pandemic. People's responses to the coronavirus going around the place was to just take themselves out of the labour market in many cases. Now, that's fallen in the months since, but it's still above pre-pandemic levels. So economic inactivity is possibly one to watch. So those are the headline indicators. And like I say, I think that indicates a certain tightening up of the labour market. But, and there's a big but here, what about the numbers that remain on furlough? So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is a slide, again, from the Office for National Statistics, and it shows how the numbers on furlough were very high initially back in June last year. And then they fell, but then they rose again with subsequent lockdowns. But they've since come down a bit, and they've kind of bottomed out. Now, the axis on the left hand shows proportions of the workforce, and I'll translate that for you. Roughly speaking, there's about 1.5 million employees, depending on how you measure it. I mean, estimates do vary, but about 1.5 million employees still on furlough. And the orthodoxy up until now had been that once people come off furlough, redundancies are likely to increase. That firms won't be able to, won't have the activity, won't have the work to give all these people that had been on furlough. Now, that remains to be seen, I'd have to say, and it isn't borne out by other statistics, which, if you go to the next slide, Louisa, I can show you now. This slide is from the Government Insolvency Service, and they very usefully produce a monthly digest of the of employers' intentions to make people redundant. Employers have to register, as you well know, HR1s if they intend to make anybody redundant. And you can see that there's two sets of columns. One is the turquoise or light green one for last year, and then there's the dark blue one for this year. And you can see that last year the numbers of redundancies were really quite high, especially in the summer months. By contrast, the numbers of redundancy this year are generally lower than last year, and they've been falling. And the latest figures for August show, relatively low redundancy intentions. So it looks like that the kind of soft underbelly that the numbers on furlough might represent for the labour market aren't such a soft underbelly after all. In other words, it looks like, furlough will end, but most people will find work. In fact, there's an interesting question posed by it. When it finally does end completely, and it's already started ramping down, whether some of the labour shortages that are being experienced in certain sectors could be plugged by people coming off furlough. Now, my own view on that is that I don't think that will happen in the short term. I think in part that's because a lot of the labour shortages are in skilled areas, and therefore it would take time to train people up. Whereas most of the people on furlough are from areas like hospitality and so on, where they have skills, absolutely, but they don't necessarily have the sorts of skills that are in scarce supply elsewhere in the labour market. But I could be wrong. Let's see what happens. So can we move on to the next slide, please? So that was an overview of the labour market and where I think it's at overall. But for yourselves, when it comes to pay decisions, probably recruitment and retention is the most important factor. And what this slide does is it shows findings from our survey last year on the left, and then findings from our survey this year on the right. And last year, we can see that recruitment, if we take that first, just wasn't a problem for most of the participants in our survey. Something like 76% said, not a problem, recruitment's fine. This year, very, very different. 66% say it's fairly difficult. And the hard to fill roles include the ones that we've all come to know and love, including HGV drivers, which we're hearing a lot about at the moment. But as we've heard from Louisa, and as we know from our own work with employers, it's not just those roles, there are other roles involved as well. Though still I would say, confined to certain areas of the labour market. So that's recruitment. Retention, if we move to the next slide, again, so looking again at the contrast between last year and this year. Last year, not a problem. This year, completely different. So the sample this year splits almost equally between those finding it not a problem, so the same as last year, but around half, around the same proportion have said it's very, very difficult. And what's interesting for us is that the hard to retain roles, they do include some of the ones I've mentioned in respect of recruitment, so the usual suspects, but employers are also telling us that hard to retain roles include people like call center workers, customer service staff, retail staff. In other words, your kind of general back office and front of house positions. And I think what's happening is that or part of what's happening in any way is that, as the economy reopens, as the vaccination program takes hold, I'm not going to say the pandemic isn't with us, because it is still with us. People are moving job, and that's one of the reasons that these roles, these kind of general roles, of which there are many in organisations around the country, I think this is why organisations are finding it hard to retain these roles. So that's the general picture on recruitment and retention. If we move on to the next slide, I wanted to talk about the sectoral variations. Now, when it comes to recruitment difficulties, these were worst in not-for-profit, especially care services and housing. So that's not surprising. A sector where it's almost a vocational choice to work in, and it's more difficult to work in there than it ever has been, really, given the circumstances with the health emergency. But those difficulties also acute in manufacturing, and then private services isn't far behind. Now, on retention, it's a slightly different situation. Retention problems are most severe in private services, and I think that's connected to what I said about people moving jobs now that the economy is reopened. NFP is in the middle, and then manufacturing down towards the end, but not quite at the end, because it's the public sector that seems to be experiencing the least recruitment and retention issues. And I suppose that's for reasons, secular reasons that we're well aware of. People tend to opt to work in the public sector and then stay there because it's a career, it's a vocation, and so on. So just moving on to the next slide, I wanted to just look at logistics, so lorry drivers, in a little bit of detail at the moment, just to give you an indication of how these things can be complicated. And what the two lines show is they show the change in the number of HG drivers in the UK by nationality. So the blue line is UK-born drivers and the orange line is EU-born drivers, so drivers from the EU countries that had come to Britain to work. And as you can see, over the period covered by the figures, which run from 2014 to the present, you can see the change. But I want to draw your attention to the right-hand part of the chart, where we look at the most recent changes. Now, if you look at the orange line, and that's the EU-born drivers, you can see that there's a decline there. So definitely a decline, probably to do with a number of factors, but Brexit and coronavirus no doubt have played a role there as well. But if you were to say that that's the entire reason for the shortages of HGV drivers at the moment, I think you'd be wrong, because if you look at the line above, which is UK drivers, you can see there's actually a much sharper fall in the number of UK-born HGV drivers. So Brexit, unlikely to play a role there. Coronavirus may play a role, but other factors are at play as well. And those are perhaps connected to some of the anecdotes we're hearing about the pay rises that HGV drivers are seeing at the moment. In other words, what I'm saying is paying conditions in the sector and for those types of roles was probably a factor in the shortfall that's evidenced by those figures, and that's ONS data, by the way. So it's official data. So just to zero in on a particular sector there to show you, what the position is at the moment. So finally, to try and come to a close, I wanted to talk a little bit about, what I think might be the different pressures on pay at the moment. And I do this every year, and I usually start by deciding which order the columns are going to go in. So am I going to put upward pressures first, or am I going to put downward pressures first? So what I've done this year is I've put upward pressures first, because in my view, I think what we're seeing from the survey, so the findings that I've just presented to you, and what we're seeing in the rest of the economy, the labour market, and with economic indicators like inflation, indicates to me that on balance, upward pressures probably weigh heavier in the balance than downward or countervailing pressures at the moment. And that's what I would say overall. But, let's work through it. So on the one hand, we've had the reopening of the economy. We've had a certain amount of economic recovery. Against this, you could say that the growth figures, the GDP figures that have been released recently by the ONS, aren't very strong at all. And in fact, they're not. And what we're perhaps seeing, and I say this very tentatively, is a recovery, but a recovery that's characterized by difficulties, by bottlenecks, and perhaps a recovery that might begin to falter. So the potential for stagnation. And if inflation rises, we may even experience a kind of a tiny bit of what used to be called in the 1970s. Some people will be old enough to remember that. I'm not quite old enough to remember it, but I've heard about it. Stagflation. So stagnation on the one hand, but rising prices on the other. And there's just a bit of a whiff of that around at the moment. I've talked about the labour market. I've talked about how it favours employees at the moment. It's possible that the ending of furlough could loosen that a little bit. But like I've said, the possibility of redundancies as furlough ends isn't borne out by the figures. Now, reality could change that because those figures are always a backward look. But let's see what happens. So at the moment, there's more or less a tight labour market. I've talked about inflation, but on your side is the fact that that's not likely to last for a long time, or at least that's what people think, and I personally I tend to agree with that. I don't see inflationary pressures as becoming a long-term thing, but I could be wrong. So let's see what happens. There's a number of other things that I think are creating upward pressure on pay at the moment. One of these is that in order to try and retain people and to recruit people as well, a lot of employers are looking to provide progression for staff or upskilling existing staff. And there's been stories in the press about how Amazon, for example, are providing much more developed career paths for their staff. They're paying for training, they're paying for education in a way that they weren't before. So that presents an upward pressure on pay. But at the same time, there's a certain amount of restructuring going on in the economy. And to the extent that that's a focus for your individual organisation, that might take some of the focus away from pay. We've heard from Tim about the target for the national living wage. That will mean, I think, that the increase in the living wage next year is going to be higher than the increase we've seen this year. So you'll already be factoring that into your plans. But at the same time, it goes perhaps without saying, but I'll say it anyway. You'll also be labouring under affordability constraints. You'll have to have an argument, a discussion with your chief finance officers. You'll be saying one thing probably about the recruitment and retention situation, or the labour market situation, and I'm sure your finance officers will be saying something else about affordability and trying to contain wage costs in various ways. So that's a kind of potential offsetting pressure. During the pandemic, frontline staff have had generally better pay rises than other groups. So the people seeing the best pay rises have been nurses, retail staff, care staff, drivers, as we've been discussing. So that's been the big theme, really, hasn't it, of the pandemic? The way in which people, jobs that were previously maybe not noticed, they just happened. They just went about their business, but those jobs have been in the spotlight, and they've been generally rewarded across the economy. But at the same time, there are other changes taking place, and that's been reflected in some of the debate here today. Particularly the hybridization of working. That might permit a certain amount of cost control opportunity for employers as well. Given that you don't necessarily have to have people working in the same locations as you had previously, or at least not all the time. Whether hybridization creates exactly the same opportunities for cost control as constant home working, of course, is another issue. It probably doesn't actually, but nevertheless, there might be opportunities for cost control around that. One last thing I'll mention in terms of both upward and downward pressures is, of course, higher national insurance contributions, which will take effect from next April. I think they'll potentially anyway feed staff demands for higher pay. In negotiated situations, that will probably be cancelled out by the employer saying, yeah, but we've got to pay higher national insurance contributions too. And that's absolutely right. And I'd imagine, that will end the argument there and then. But it doesn't take away from the fact of the higher NICs for employees. In other words, whatever the outcome of arguments between negotiated groups on the one hand and employers on the other, I think those pressures will still be there on both sides. And a number of commentators have talked about how the NICs, that change and that higher rate could become baked in. In other words, there could be future rises in those NICs. I think that will present an upward pressure, or at least a tension in the relationship between employees and employers that really wasn't there before. So, final slide. Thanks, Louisa. Just a few things that I think people need to think about. Things I think are key issues, all on one slide because we haven't got a lot of time. I've talked a lot about basic pay, we all have. The other thing that's in focus at the moment is shift premiums. Shift working is fairly widespread across the economy. We've had lots of inquiries from, including some major employers saying, we're worried our shift premiums aren't sufficient. Can you benchmark them for us and let us know what we should be paying? So they're definitely in focus. Tesco, for example, increased their night shift premiums recently, we noticed. So that's one issue. The other issue is the thing I mentioned about employees switching jobs, now that the economy has reopened. So managing turnover is a big challenge for HR people. You're going to have to, position yourself to try and retain as many people as you can, but then also, make sure that your market position is correct vis-a-vis recruitment as well. And of course, you've got to square the circle with affordability too. And I guess that's where that's where benchmarking services like ours really do come in, because as Louisa explained, it allows you to gauge the market as accurately as possible, and I think that's very important. And especially when you've got to present plans for wage rises to chief finance officers and get them past those people who will recognise the need to recruit, retain, and motivate people, but will also want to make sure that it's contained within cost envelopes. So the market's going to be really important. Internal equities, I think, are going to be important. Gender pay gap, ongoing focus for large employers. I agree with Darren that we're not likely to see ethnicity pay gap legislation very soon, but that doesn't mean that employers aren't getting on with it. We're seeing, lots of employers doing work in this area. Kanisha outlined some of our capabilities. So, if that's something that you haven't done yet, but you want to look at, by all means, talk to us and we can help with that. And then finally, just some comments to end. I've mentioned well-being and mental health. Both of those are higher up the agenda as a result of the pandemic. But I think that the key thing is that the pandemic has injected a kind of element of risk into jobs that were otherwise not risky at all. And I think that changes the relationship and the bargain between managers and managed in ways that I think we've yet to see. I'm not saying it's a permanent change, because if the pandemic does eventually abate, then things might reset to where they were before. But I think it has changed certain ways in which the employment relationship gets conducted, and that will have consequences for pay and conditions. And we'll continue to monitor them, and we'll continue to monitor them with your help. So my final comment is to say thanks to you all for taking part in our surveys, and to keep doing it as well. And that way we can build up the bigger picture for you, present it to you, and hopefully help you make decisions in the years ahead. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.